Welcome you all to this session of the Princeton-Bucharest virtual seminar. The meeting tonight is dedicated to the problem of mind-body in early modern philosophy. We are going to have two papers and three speakers. Our first paper tonight is Barnaby Hutchins on the metaphysical gap patching, Descartes on why there is no mind-body problem. Barnaby, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dana. And let me see if I can share this without messing it up. Okay. Is that working? Do people see it?
Yeah. That's great, it's working.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so thanks for the introduction, Dana, and thank you, Claudia and Dan, for running this as well. And okay, let's get started. So, oh, come on. My computer's not responding to me now. Okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to talk about mind-body relations in Descartes, and I'm going to base this talk pretty much entirely on the correspondence on the topic that Descartes has with Princess Elizabeth. And that's partly for time reasons, partly because I think some interesting stuff is done there. But this reading can be applied to the other places we talk about it too. And so Elizabeth writes to Descartes and asks him about how mind and body are supposed to interact. And he gives this, she's expecting a sort of technical reply in terms of his ontology and how those things are supposed to work together. And he gives what looks like a pretty commonsensical reply, which seems weird. And when people have read this in the literature, the tendency has generally been to either say, okay, he's giving this commonsensical reply, it doesn't have much metaphysical import, or to try to find resources outside what he says here, either in his own ontology or more often from scholastic work to translate into what he's doing, to try to provide ways of saying how this could possibly work. I'm going to do something different in that I'm going to take what he says to Elizabeth and take it very seriously. My computer has stopped working. Okay. I can take it very seriously and give a very literal reading of what he says and try and look for the metaphysical implications of what he's saying to Elizabeth. That's the idea. And the analysis is going to look something like this. I'm going to say what he says in this correspondence does provide a metaphysical commitment to the union as something ontological. So the union is something real, it exists, it's an ontological feature of the world. But it's not one that's grounded in his dualist ontology, unlike the other features of the world. Instead, it's grounded elsewhere, and it's grounded in something like experience. And what that implies, and this is the bit where maybe it gets a bit weird, and yeah, this might look like a crazy interpretation. Well, that implies that he has two separate metaphysics going on that he's using to make a more complete picture of the universe. He has two separate metaphysics and that he has two different ontologies, but also that he has different metaphysical principles that are informing the development of those ontologies. Now, when he sets up his dualist ontology, it has a union-shaped gap in it. It's something that can't explain, something that can't be accounted for within the dualist ontology. And it has this gap. And what he's going to try to do is to patch that gap in the dualist ontology by taking the union from this other ontology and just plugging it in there to make things work. And that's what I mean by metaphysical gap patching. So Elizabeth starts like this. She says, Descartes, please tell me how the soul of a human being, being only a thinking substance, can determine the bodily spirits in order to bring about voluntary actions. If you want the mind to move the body, then it seems like physical contact is required and or extension is required, but you're excluding extension from the notion of the soul. And physical contact seems to be completely incompatible with a material thing. So on her telling, you have a soul or mind and you have body, and then you have some kind of causation happening from mind to body. But for that to happen, you need some sort of principle of bodily causation, which is missing in mind. And of course, the causation works the other way around, and the body affects the mind. But for that to work, you need a principle of mental causation in the body, which is also missing. And this is captured in Descartes' commitment to the causal containment, in that what's in the effect has to already be in the cause. You can't have something in the effect that isn't already in the cause. And so if there's nothing bodily in the mind, then how's it going to cause something bodily? And that's the idea. And I apologize to all of you who know this very well already, but bear with me, I'll run through this part quickly. So Descartes' response to Elizabeth makes two major points. One is that we have a separate primitive notion of the union. He explains that there are certain primitive notions in us, and for the body in particular, we have only the notion of extension. And for the soul, we have the notion of thought. But for the soul and body together, we have only the notion of their union. So there's a conceptual separation between the notions of mind and body and union. They're completely separate notions. And being primitive notions, each of them can only be understood through itself. So it makes a lot of sense that you can't understand mind through body, you can't understand body through mind. But the counterintuitive part is also you can't understand the union of mind and body through either mind or body. So this also means that his notion of union isn't grounded in the notions of mind and body. It's not coming from them. Which means that if you want a metaphysical explanation of the union, you're not going to get it in terms of mind and body. The other point he makes is that mind-body interaction, which is what Elizabeth is directly asking about, isn't modeled on body-to-body interaction. So he says the principal cause of our errors lies in our ordinarily wanting to use these notions to explain things which they do not pertain. For instance, when one wants to conceive the way in which the soul meets the body by appealing to the way in which one body is moved by another body, we're making a mistake if we try to explain how the soul moves the body by appealing to the way that bodies move other bodies, which is what Elizabeth seems to be doing when she says, there's nothing extensional in the mind, how can it move something extensional in the body? So the notion of mind-body interaction is not going to be grounded in the notion of body-to-body interaction. And there seems to be a simple consequence of what he says about the notion of union, on which depends the notion of the power of the soul has to move the body and the power of the body has to move the soul. So Elizabeth's question was, how do mind and body interact? How does this one element in your ontology affect the other element in your ontology? And Descartes' response, at least initially, is just to say, no, mind and body interaction can't be explained in these terms. You can't explain how mind and body interact by appealing to mind and body. So his response is purely negative. He's just saying, that doesn't work. You can't do it that way. The question you're trying to ask is not a good question. To which she responds, I like to think there's a bit of sarcasm in the way she's responding here. She responds that, okay, you say I'm getting it wrong, I'm doing things badly, I haven't understood, fair enough, I'm not following the rules. Okay, but still, how is this supposed to work? How does the mind move the body? And it's interesting that where she seems to think her failure is, where she tells him, okay, I'm obviously getting things wrong here, is in acquiring the habit of meditation in accordance with his rules. She thinks that she's not doing the meditative methodology properly, which is supposed to be what gets you to metaphysics for Descartes. So obviously she's doing something wrong there, she thinks. Tell me, what am I doing wrong? And his response is that, no, she's not doing anything wrong with that. She hasn't got anything wrong with the meditative methodology. Rather, these meditations are the things that have made her, Elizabeth, find obscurity in the notion we have of the union. It's trying to use meditation to understand the union that's the problem. And that's because the soul is only conceived by the pure understanding. And the body can also be known by the understanding alone, which is an interesting thing for him to say, but not what I'm going to talk about. But those things which pertain to the union of the soul and body are known only obscurely by the understanding alone, or even by the understanding aided by the imagination, but they're known very clearly by the senses. So the methodological point he's making here is that the methodology of meditation, which is the basis for deriving his dualist ontology, that is what provides him the metaphysical principles for setting up a dualist ontology, can't be the basis for understanding the union. Instead, we understand the union through using only life and ordinary conversations and abstaining from meditating and studying those things that exercise the imagination. That's how we learn to conceive the union of the soul and the body. And he makes the point that it doesn't seem to me that the human mind is capable of conceiving very distinctly and at the same time, the distinction between the soul and the body and their union. Since to do so is necessary to conceive them as one single thing, and at the same time to conceive them as two, which is contradictory. So trying to think of the union through the dualist ontology in terms of mind and body obscures the union qua union. Whereas on the other hand, trying to think of mind and body in terms of the union obscures the distinction between them. You can't do both at the same time. So if we think that Cartesian metaphysics is something that comes about only through this meditative methodology that produces these principles, then the terms of his metaphysics, the ontology itself, mind and body, and the methodology of metaphysics are both incapable, he says, of explaining the union and then explaining how mind and body interact, which suggests a kind of defeatism about the metaphysics of the union. It seems like something that, okay, maybe his metaphysics just can't get this. And this is something that Bar-Ilan has talked a lot about in her phenomenological reading of the union. She's not concerned with the metaphysical problem. She says that if Descartes had no real philosophical solution to the famous mind-body problem, then at least he was, big enough to admit that the difficulty and to recognize the limits of the knowledge that can be acquired in terms of clear and distinct rational concepts. This can be seen as a recognition of the limits of rational knowledge and explanation, and also at the same time of the importance of daily experience, intercourse, and action, too often neglected by philosophers. And this is a good point. It's an important point. And philosophers have a tendency to set up a system and then say, well, what the system establishes is what exists, and what the system doesn't establish, well, that's some kind of nonsense that people talk about in daily life, but that's not real, that's not the real stuff, that's not proper ontology. That's just, silliness. And it's worth noting that Descartes pays attention to the things that we might expect him to dismiss. So it's a good point. But if you stay with just pure phenomenology, if you stay with the kind of defeatism about the metaphysics of the union, then you never really get an answer to Elizabeth's question. She says, in response to all this that Descartes has been saying to her, yeah. I also find that senses show me that the soul moves the body, but they teach me nothing of the way in which it does so. There's no answer to the how question. How do mind and body interact? So if this is the case, if you want to be defeatist about the metaphysics of the union, then we're saying that Descartes has no way of explaining this feature of the world, this thing that he seems to accept exists, but his ontology, his metaphysics, has no way of accounting for it. It means its ontology is full of gaps, all these unions walking around in the world doing the things that they do, talking and eating and laughing and so on. Those are missed out by metaphysics. So those are things that it can't access. And so if you want to be defeatist about the metaphysics of the union, it seems you want to be defeatist about Descartes' metaphysics as a whole. It's not doing the job of explaining everything. If you want to throw out metaphysics of the union, you probably want to throw out the whole metaphysics, and then what's Descartes left with as a metaphysician, at least. So if my computer, okay, good, thank you, computer. So yeah, So, okay, I want to say you shouldn't be defeated about metaphysics. I want to say that you can get metaphysical implications out of this. But it's true that in this correspondence, Descartes stays on pretty much an epistemological level, or at least a somewhat epistemological level. Whether this counts technically as true epistemology is a different issue. I think it does, but I won't go into that. But given that what he's talking about is how we know of the union, is it then illegitimate to jump to metaphysics? And I think if you don't want to be defeatist about metaphysics, then it's probably reasonable to assume that what he says here does have some metaphysical implications. So the issue is, what is Descartes doing when he talks about the union in this correspondence, in Meditation 6, and the passions, and so on? What is he doing there? He seems to treat it as a feature of the world. He seems to treat it as something ontological. And so what I'm going to do in the rest of the paper is to give an analysis of what it would mean on the basis of what he says to Elizabeth to treat the union as a feature of the world. So the ontology has these elements in it. It has body and mind, and it has union. And I want to use what he says about the primitive notions as kind of proxies for the ontology. So body would be grounded in extension. That seems pretty uncontroversial. Minds would be grounded in thought. And so both of these would be things grounded within the dualist ontology. The union isn't, but it's grounded in something like experience. This is what I take it he means when he talks about life and ordinary conversation is what lets us know about the union. It's experience that grounds union. So I'm saying the union is a real feature, an ontological feature of the world. And you might think, is this trialism? Is this just saying there's another substance that he has? I'm not going to go into the issues with trialism, but I will say, no, this is not trialism. The union on this reading is not a substance. It's not a substance in part because it's a completely different metaphysical framework. So the substance terminology is something that he comes to through, well, obviously he inherited from tradition, but he sets up the notion of substances and what they mean within his system through the meditation methodology and through the metaphysical principles of that. So it's not clear that you can take the terminology from that framework and put it into some other framework. But maybe more to the point, this union is not extensionally different from mind and body. So if I talk about this mind and body, and I talk about this union, those two statements have the same reference. They refer to the same extension. This union, this mind and body, same thing. That's what I take it is going on when he talks about this switching between conceiving of the union as difference between mind and body and conceiving it as one single thing. The picture would look something like this. You have a mind and a body and you have a union, but these things are coextensive. They're the same thing. Nevertheless, they are distinct insofar as they are grounded differently. So mind and body are grounded in a dualism, and union is grounded in experience. So they have the same extension. They're the same thing in extensional terms, but there's a hyper-intentional difference between them. Now, you could do this whole thing without using the extensional, hyper-intentional terminology, but I think it's a useful and efficient way of trying to make clear what these issues are. There's a hyper-intentional distinction between union and as one single thing and mind and body. So that would mean that his dualist ontology is still extensionally complete. If you take the mind and body, it will cover the whole universe. Everything is mind and body. That's fine. It tiles everything. You're not missing out on any things by sticking with the dualist ontology. But hyper-intentionally, it's incomplete. There's still a distinction that it misses. And these are where the ontological gaps lie in this level. So to get to actual ontological completeness, to have a fine-grained enough system to account for the differences in ontology in the universe that Descartes sets up, he needs to patch these hyper-intentional gaps in his dualist ontology. And he does that by importing the union from this other framework and using it to make the whole thing come together. And in doing so, he produces the system he gives us, the system he presents, is not just a dualism, it's a blended system of two metaphysical frameworks. So it's not a dualism, it's not a trialism, but a blend of two things with completely distinct principles. Okay, going back to the epistemological level. On the basis of this reading, this is how I understand this stuff about switching between conceiving mind and body as two distinct things versus union as one single thing. It's a switch between conceiving them under one framework, under the dualist framework, the mind and body. Under the other framework, they're a union. So this switch is a switch of metaphysical frameworks. That's what happens when you take them to be one thing or two things. Now, all of this does give him an answer to the how question. Whether it's a satisfactory answer, we'll see. So under the dualist framework, mind and body really are distinct. They can't interact. There's no possible interaction between them. And so there's no metaphysical explanation of their interaction at stake. These things are not interacting if looked at under a dualist framework. So there's no question of trying to explain how they're working. But under the other framework, the union framework, for want of a better term, the union just is one single thing. So there's no issue of interaction because there aren't two separate things to interact. You might want to call it intra-action, sort of action within the thing. I'm not sure about that terminology, but maybe it works. And in this case, this is how you get your metaphysical explanation. So if I want to explain how I want to say some words, and then my diaphragm and lungs and larynx and mouth all do stuff to make this sound come out, make a physical occurrence. If I want to explain the connection between my volition and the physical action, that metaphysical explanation is grounded in the union framework, not in the dualist framework. Under the dualist framework, I can say things about what the body is doing, I can say things about what the mind is doing, but the connection is something that is an explanation that you ground only in the union framework. Okay, 2 more slides and I'm done. Okay, so there's a couple of things from the literature. You might wonder what kind of ideas we have of the union under this reading of it. And originally I was going to say that we have a clear and confused idea of the union under this, and try and get some kind of, say that there's metaphysical work you can do with confusion. And that's kind of interesting, there's metaphysical work you can do with confusion. But a week or so ago, Andrea Christofotou sent me his recent paper on the union, where he makes a pretty convincing argument that insofar as we have a primitive notion of union, then that notion is going to be distinct. It's not confused because the primitive notion can't be separated into more things, so it's a distinct notion. I think that's probably right. So then how I would understand what's happening in the under my reading is that when we're looking at the union under the dualist framework, we have a confused idea. It's probably not actually a clear idea, it's probably an obscure and confused idea. Because we're trying to smush two things together and explain that two things which don't go together. So we're sticking things together, it's confusion, it's a confusion of things. But when we conceive the union under the other framework, then we have a perfectly clear and distinct idea. And that's fine, because it is just one thing that we're dealing with under that framework. Another thing from literature, what Deborah Brown and then later Deborah Brown and Calvin Normore call the minimal versus maximal self. And other people have talked about this. Alison Simmons has talked about it in different terms. Colin Chapman has talked about it, but I'll just deal with the Brown version for now. So the minimal self would be when Descartes talks about, I am nothing but my soul, which is, kind of the main point of the cogito. I am just a soul. Everything else is accidental, can get rid of it. The maximal self, there's other cases where he talks about as a union or a whole person. And there seems to be some odd contradiction on what he takes the self to be. Is it just this one soul, or is it this whole union? He seems to contradict himself in the things he says. And in an earlier paper, Deborah Brown says this is just there's a difference in explanatory strategies. And as far as I remember, there's no real metaphysical upshot to that. It's just that there are contexts in which you want to explain the self as being only a soul, and contexts in which you want to explain the self as being a union, and that makes a difference for those contexts, but metaphysically, whatever. In the later book, Brown and Moore talk about it as ontological and being a mereological difference between them. Under the reading I'm giving here, the minimal self will be the self you get when you're looking at yourself under the dualist framework. And the maximal self will be the self you get under the other framework. And then the difference between these two selves is ontological, but it's a hyperintentional difference. And on this reading, then you really do get to have the self under the dualist framework as being properly excluding the body. So it really is a very minimal self because you're looking at it just through this framework. And I've gone slightly over time, so rather than reading you this, I'll just leave it here temporarily. It's just a summary of what I've said. It's a repetition on the first slide, so thank you.
Thank you, Barnaby. We are going to move straight to the next paper. Let me remind you, especially to those of you who are here for the first time, that it would be wonderful and very useful for us if you can ask your questions in the chat, even as starting right now, so that when we come to the question and answers, we can make some sort of a thematical order as opposed to just the order in which questions arrived and group them together. So please do ask questions in the chat. And meanwhile, we are going to go to our next speakers. So the next paper moves to Spinoza. Spinoza on the capacities of the body and the wonders of the mind. The authors are Ohad, Nachtomy, and Oberto Marrama. So can you please share your screen? And you have the floor. I think Oberto is starting and then Ohad. You probably have to switch your mics on.
Ohad is starting with the presentation.
Okay, Ohad is starting, sorry. Ohad is first then. Ohad, you have the floor. Ohad, you have to
I'm good.
Okay.
Okay.
Switching the microphone on can help.
Can you hear me well?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, good. So first, thank you so much for having us. It's a wonderful recollection of the evenings and days in Brunn. And yeah, I'll just basically introduce the paper and then I'll let Oberto do the hard work. So, right, so I do the introduction. So in the third part of the ethics, in the Scholium to Proposition 2, Spinoza writes, no one has yet determined what the body can do. That is, experience has not yet taught anyone what the body can do from the laws of nature alone. Insofar as nature is only considered to be corporeal, and what the body can do only if it is determined by the mind. For no one has yet come to know the structure or the making of the body so accurately that he could explain all its functions. Not to mention that many things are observed in the lower animal which far surpass human ingenuity, and that sleepwalkers do a great many things in their sleep, which they would not dare do awake. This shows well enough that the body itself, simply from the laws of its nature, can do many things which its mind wonders at. So this wonderful and remarkable passage is all the more interesting in light of the following points. As Spinoza stresses, the mind and the body are one and the same thing. And the mind is the idea of the body, or the body is the object of the mind. And in light of Spinoza's thesis, emphasized in this very proposition, that the body cannot determine the mind to thinking and the mind cannot determine the body to anything, one must wonder, how is it possible for the body to be capable of things that would astonish its mind? The answer seems to lie in Spinoza's view that not every idea is an adequate idea, or that not every idea attracts an adequate cause. As he put this in proposition 24 of the second part, the human mind does not involve adequate idea of the parts composing the human body. Indeed, Spinoza's ethical project in the Ethic turns on this subtle view, namely that one can transform inadequate ideas, loosely speaking passions, into adequate ideas or actions. And as it turns out, this very transformation results in increasing our power of action, which in effect reduces the power of the passion over us, and thus would help us liberate ourselves from the servitude of the passions. And this, indeed, a way to articulate the ethical call of the ethics. Transforming inadequate ideas into adequate ones is what the ethic recommends in order to obtain better knowledge of God or nature. In Spinoza, Le Problème d'Expression, Deleuze makes a very insightful remark about this passage. He writes, when Spinoza says that we do not even know what the body is capable of, this is practically a cry of war, a cri de guerre, he says. So a war cry whose prime meaning is ethical. Deleuze writes that the theory of power according to which actions and passions of the body accompany action and passions of the soul amounts to an ethical vision of the world. According to Deleuze, this is a cry of war against the Platonic derision of the body and its Christian variations, according to which the flesh is the source of sin, and in Augustinian terms, the reason for our aversion from God. In Spinoza, we see a curious reversal of this negative attitude towards the body. For Spinoza, an adequate knowledge of God and nature must go through knowledge of the body. Thus, rather than taking us away from God, as in the traditional Augustinian and Cartesian view, in Spinoza, one cannot attain knowledge of God without attending to the body. And indeed, knowledge of the body would lead us, in effect, to knowledge of God. However curious. Note also how different this is from the Cartesian tradition and with its Augustinian backgrounds of looking for God within the depth of one's soul. So in order to further explore and substantiate Spinoza's ethical vision suggested here, let us recall the example of sleepwalking. When we walk in our sleep, the body seems to act of its own accord, without any direction of the mind. This seems to be Spinoza's most direct point in this proposition. Namely, the mind has no command over the body. And this is supposed to refute the common but false presumption of the ability of the will to control the body. It's Spinoza's observation that the body is capable of things that astonish the mind raises further questions. First, precisely because the mind and the body are seen as one and the same thing, observing and experiencing our bodily behavior in similar cases, such as breathing, for instance, would seem to have the potential of extending our knowledge of the mind as well. More generally, Spinoza's observations may seem as a call to explore our bodily capacities, especially those that often escape our attention and awareness, as exemplified in sleepwalking, but also in more mundane cases of breathing and walking. At the same time, the structure of the ethics makes it evident that Spinoza's prime attention, or seems to make it evident that Spinoza's prime attention in the book is not in the human body, but in the human mind. So this is beginning from book 2. And as Raphael Andro observes, in the ethics, there are almost no specific claims about the human body, nor are there any technical terms to refer to its parts. This is particularly astonishing in a work which partly deals with the so-called union of mind and body and the power of the mind over its passions. Precisely for this reason, one must wonder what shape a study of our bodily capacities would take, In other words, Spinoza's attitude towards the body, giving it a prominent role on the one hand and saying almost nothing specifically about it on the other, is a puzzle that calls for some interpretive work. The question what the body can do, or what are the capabilities of the body, both active and effective, seems to present a project of self-study. Indeed, it seems that the only way to study the mind in Spinoza's framework goes through a study of the body's capacities and limitations. As he makes clear, the mind does not know itself except as it perceives the ideas of the affections of the body. And knowledge of these ideas necessarily involves knowledge of the mind. It's also worth noting that the phrase what the body can do, or the capacities of the body, calls for two distinct sets of observations, namely what the body is capable of doing, that is, its actions, and the ways in which the body can be affected, which depend on its particular affective mechanisms and structure. And we already noted that the duality between actions and passions lies at the very heart of Spinoza's ethical project. The project of studying the body's capacities and affective structure is an essential part of Spinoza's project of liberation from the power of the passions. Indeed, there's no studying the mind without attending to the body, and there's obviously no studying our nature and our susceptibility to be affected by other finite modes without studying our bodily structure and its particular susceptibilities to be affected. For the mind, according to Spinoza, is the ideas we form of our body. Hence, the only way for studying the human nature goes through studying the body, that is, its capacities and limitations. But how exactly are we to go about it? Is this through science, or through introspection, or through some psychophysical practices such as yoga or Tai Chi, or through philosophy, or perhaps through all of them? And since I mentioned this point, perhaps I'll just say that in a way, this is how I got interested in this topic, because I've written this book, some of you know, this book about it's called the Psychophysical Lab, and is pushing for an Aristotelian position there. And Dor Yinon, who's also attending this talk, actually drew me to this direction and to this citation, and this is how I got interested in this. So in a way, this is part of my motivation here. So let me just recap the introduction. There are two inverse and related questions in this context. One, how is it possible for us to come to know our body? And then the other is, how is it possible for us to be ignorant of our body? And so in this paper, we proceed by taking these questions in order. So here I turn to Oberto to present the rest of the paper.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ohad. Can you
share the screen again? Sorry, you probably need to share the screen again if you want to show us slides.
Yes, I go back on the slides very soon. Just wanted to take a moment to thank you in person, actually, and the organizer and the attendees to the seminar. I guess it's very much appreciated that you put this thing together, especially in this moment. It's great. So just a thank you, and then I move on and I keep sharing the slides and start back from the conundrum that Ohad very well introduced. Yes, we start from this from this problem. We have Spinoza that on one hand claims that the mind and the body are identical, that the mind is the idea of the body, that the mind must perceive everything that happens in the body. On the other hand, he provides a battery of examples to show how and why the mind does not know completely the body, does not know adequately the body. Why is it ignorant of the body? So it's a tricky topic, I think. Many scholars have approached it, and Ohad and I try to take the challenge and to provide our interpretation. In particular, starting from explaining in the first place how can Spinoza claim that the mind is ignorant about the body. One thing that I wanted to do just out of as an experiment was try to avoid to turn to multi-layer theories of perception and theories of consciousness, and going deep to analyze what is actually Spinoza argument for the reasons of the ignorance of the body. You see that it doesn't refer to different kinds of perceptions. It doesn't refer to consciousness or to lack of consciousness or to the capacity of penetrating into the small components of the body. What it does, he redefines the body in order to make it match with the mind. So we describe the mind as a complex idea, which is composed in itself by the amount of possible perceptions, and then given at any possible time, and then we have to describe the body, provide an account of body that matches with this description. So the first intuition was that Spinoza, instead of to address the problem of the ignorance, what he does is that he redefines the body, and he provides a non-naive definition of the body, according to which the body does not coincide, let's say, with a certain amount of matter in a certain space, namely the one that is with the matter that is contained within the boundaries delimited by our skin, nor does it coincide with a certain amount of organs. It does not coincide with the sense organs in particular. Spinoza describes basically the body. We can go into the intricacies of this description, but as a stream of bodies. Okay, it is movement generated by an infinite stream of bodies that basically keep changing, keep interchanging, and by this interchange they give shape to what Spinoza calls a form. They interact with each other according to regular patterns. They say they transmit the movements to each other in a certain fixed manner, he says. And this is what, to some extent, composes the body. Spinoza calls it, this is a union. It is a union of body. None of this body is permanent, and the union is made up exactly by this interchange, by this exchange of bodies that keep happening with the external to the internal. I could provide like a very trivial example. You can think about, I mean, what happens when you see a tornado. Okay, we have environmental circumstances, different masses of air. They push a stream of particles from one direction to the other. They take a spin. They describe actually a form, a certain body, but it would be difficult to provide to this body to some extent spatial boundary. The form created by the movement, by the whole movement is clear. It can be analyzed, but it does not coincide with any of the particles of air that come in and are then ejected outside. And the same goes for the human body. The human body is not coincident with any of the parts by which it is composed. It is not coincident with the sum of the parts. It is just coincident with the interaction that at any moment all body particles bring about. So it is a certain effect that obtains. And Spinoza said, well, each of these effects, each of these ways in which this stream of bodies exist here and now, I will call it a modification of the body. So this is an affection. So when Spinoza says, okay, the mind must perceive all of the affections of the body, what he is saying is that the mind is always at once perception of the way in which an incredibly complex stream of body eventually interact with each other. If you want in physical terms, you might call it the resultant of different forces that altogether they bring about a unique effect. When all the bodies interact together to bring one effect differentiated by the external, Spinoza say, I will consider them one single body. And this seems to me to save us to the need of asking ourselves why we do not perceive to some extent changes in the body, such as those that happen into our own bodily organs, exactly because these changes by themselves do not, our body does not amount to these changes alone. So the argument by which, based on this account of the body, Spinoza then demonstrates the fact that our ignorance is based on the first premise, as I was saying, that we cannot know the human body except through ideas of affection by which the body is affected, and this is because the existing body only exists as affected, and the mind must perceive these affections. Besides this, there is nothing that constitutes the body on the one hand and the mind that knows the body on the other hand. So since we do only perceive affections, perceiving these affections does not entail perceiving the various components that bring about these affections. That is, the various parts of the body, which are in themselves individuals, Spinoza says. And then the second bit of the demonstration of the ignorance of the body is that by one idea of the affection, I cannot infer other ideas of possible affection, so that at each moment I only have one, let's say, one complex perception, one amount of perceptions that correspond to my own bodily state, but from that one I cannot jump to what the next one will be and why the previous one was in such and such a way. So I do always, my mind and my body are basically located at the end point of this very complex interaction of different forces. The body is constituted as the effect of this interaction of forces, and the mind is the perception of the end point and of the final result. So that Spinoza can to some extent maintain on the one hand that the human body must exist as we feel it, as we have sensation of it, yet feeling our body as an affection, as a result of an infinity of other bodies interacting with each other, does not illuminate by itself either on the causal origins of this interaction, because it involves bodies that considered in themselves are not necessarily identical with the final effect. It does not illuminate on the mechanism for the same reasons, and it does not illuminate the capacities of the body, understood the kind of behavioral responses that the body could deliver if put in different environmental circumstances. We can have different perception according to the variation of the environment, of the way in which these forces that interact with our parts are mutated according to the various states of affairs. So this to begin with was an effort to reply to the first question. Why Spinoza maintains at the same time that the mind is identical to the body, and nevertheless we do not have a complete knowledge of the body. To have a complete knowledge of the body entails, as demonstrated by many other scholars, a knowledge of the causal history of what produces the body as such, and it would entail also to know how the same set of forces would react if put in other circumstances. And from then on, under the suggestion of Ohad, so we were moved to analyze, okay, but now that we have a very thin account of the human body and a very thin account of the human mind, according to which the mind is just the sum of the perceptions and the body is just to some extent a very just a mere effect in extension that obtains, but the legacy of which is lost in time and space. How do we move backwards to some extent and go to explore the various causal actors that are implicated in creating the body, and so to some extent make sense of the fact that Spinoza says that we can have a more adequate knowledge of the body, and it's a difficult topic. I think there is a lot of literature that tries to deal with what Spinoza means by the transition from inadequate to adequate knowledge, and so here in order to try to flesh out our own position, I took Ohad's suggestion to try to separate different approaches that we might find in the current literature, and one that I am for other reasons, one that I have been working on a lot lately is concerns various Spinoza scholars that have the intuition to connect Spinoza's account and to some extent what Ohad called, quoting Deleuze, Spinoza's war cry for a more detailed study of the body in order to understand the mind, to this strand of recent literature that finds Spinoza as a fruitful theoretical background for the current studies in neurosciences, and for example, Heidegger, Antoine de Mazer, Steven Nadler, Henri Atlan, and these articles, I think, and books I've wrote about, I think, much of the renewed interest, I think, in Spinoza is due to this kind of studies, but they didn't seem to offer us an immediate answer, because of course, just as much as Spinoza stresses out, okay, in the example mentioned by Ohad, we have to know the knowledge, we have to have knowledge of the mechanism of the body in order to free ourselves from false beliefs like free will and so on. Approaching the human body as an external object of scientific knowledge to some extent presupposes that we have already understood the means with which have adequate, proper, true knowledge of external objects by just navigating within what so far we have described as a mere collection of sensations of one's own body. So to some extent, it doesn't offer a solution, but we have to demonstrate how do we get eventually also to the capacity to study the body as an external object. And other approaches to Spinoza's understanding of the passage between inadequate and adequate knowledge. I quote here Garber on the second point, but I think many others could be added just because it is an open issue, and I don't think that we can fix all the tensions with this topic. It's just to try to move on and add a little bit of details. Garber, in this recent article, has stressed the fact that it sounds like, according to Spinoza, that when we move to adequate knowledge of the body, we are to some extent leaving behind what I just described as the perception of the human body that is given through ideas of affection. So we come to a very different conception of mind and body than the one derived from sensation. And here I take sensation to mean, in Daniel Garber's works, the kind of knowledge of our body that we have through ideas of abstractions, through the fact that the body is modified also according to environmental circumstances and so on. The question is what is Spinoza does not seem to leave behind to leave space for other kinds of apprehension of the body through or at least during one's own existence. So just these approaches that stress to some extent the difference between inadequate and adequate knowledge, as if there were two different objects of knowledge along with two different faculties of knowing. They have a textual basis. They have a textual basis at the time in which Spinoza stresses that the imagination and understanding are different, that memory and imagination shall not be held in relation to the intellect, and here by memory and imagination we are referring exactly to inadequate sense perception of the body and through this of the external objects. On the other hand, it seems that the language of sensation and the language of perception is pervasive throughout Spinoza's work, and it also includes the higher forms of knowledge, including the intuitive knowledge, what Spinoza understands as being the highest kind of knowledge. So first, according to Spinoza, an intellect understood as a faculty in itself, in the mind, according to Spinoza, that does not exist. That is just an abstract concept. Our power of understanding is always identical to the ideas that we do have in the mind. On the other hand, the kind of knowledge that we have when we do cognize things intuitively, when we do perceive things under the aspect of eternity, when do we eventually feel our mind as eternal. Nevertheless, as I just said, I mean, according to Spinoza, we are still within the ranges of our own feelings, perception. They are sensations, and I think part of also the rhetorical force by which that Spinoza, the emphasis that Spinoza puts when he say that we feel and know by experience that we are eternal, it's exactly meant to demonstrate that. I don't, not only do I provide a demonstration why the mind is eternal, but I can tell you that every one of us feels it. It is part of our perceptual baggage to know that our mind is eternal. To find a way out in this tricky situation, and I repeat, we don't think that I think that some tensions just must be dealt with, but I found in other pre-existing literature that some good suggestions. That is that when Spinoza is talking about the idea of the body, the mind as the idea of the body, and the mind as capable of perceiving everything that happens in the body, Spinoza to some extent is moving towards what Genevieve Lloyd has called a phenomenologist approach, phenomenological approach towards the body, and she mentioned directly Merleau-Ponty and the idea of the corps vivant, of the body as living. So probably Spinoza, when he's talking about the idea of the body, is trying to say our own perceptive field is made by perceptions by which we do feel the body from within, and we do feel bodily changes, and this is also what Carolina Hübner recently has stressed. I mean, it's a footnote, but I think it's a good one where she said, okay, the human mind is essentially ideas of bodily changes. So any adequate knowledge must to some extent start from within the knowledge that is provided in the first place by sense experience, by ideas of affections of the body, by perceptions of the modifications of the way in which our bodily parts interact, however you want to call it, but a certain kind of appreciation of oneself as living in the world. And from within, we start recognizing properties that are true not only in the order of explanations of the phenomena that imply my body, but also in the order of the explanation of the phenomena external to my body. And just as a final note, and this is where I wanted to build, we wanted to build the last part of our analysis, but the conclusion is still admittedly a little bit of a work in progress, but I mean, the clue in Spinoza will find it when he describes how do we get to the first, at least in the temporal order, true ideas or adequate ideas. Spinoza does not recur to any kind of intuitive jump, or we do not have to see forms separately from the perceptions of our body. Spinoza says when our body is modified, and when we do perceive the modifications of the body, some of the properties according to which these modifications occur to happen are properties that are also shared with the external environment. And these are, according to Spinoza, the properties that cannot but be perceived adequately. And so as long as the body is modified, as long as the body is affected, and as long as the mind must in parallel perceive these bodily modifications, we will have to some extent resources in terms of universal truths, or in terms of abstract laws of nature that allow us to build up how can I say, a theoretical skeleton that allows us to explain the phenomena as deriving from an eternal, Spinoza would say, from eternal necessity, from laws of nature, from incontrovertible tenets like those that we believe to pertain to physics, geometry, and so on. What we wanted to stress and what we wanted to put pressure on is the fact that these eternal truths are embedded in body's affections, are not perceived separately from the other perceptions that we get just for the fact that we are existing and interact, and the body interacting with other bodies, but that they find in our sense experience their own source and their own also repository in as much as Spinoza says this eternal truth, in order to have an effect that extends through time, must nevertheless be remembered as maxims, so attached to images, transformed into memory, transformed into habits, and so on. And so the body, to some extent, varies, changes, and an acquired truth become habitual behavior. And this is what Spinoza then ends up by saying, we live in constant change. What we aim for is that our body develops in such a way as to be able to know itself, the external world, and nature, assuming nature equal to God for Spinoza, the most as it can. And as we try to suggest, this knowledge never to some extent crosses the boundaries of a certain form of self-awareness of the body, but finds to some extent commonalities between the body and the external worlds, and on those it builds the possible adequate knowledge. And okay, I would give floor to the question, hoping to have sufficiently explained more or less where the problem that Ohad illustrated came from, and having given, I don't think a definitive answer, but at least a suggestion of a possible answer. And thank you very much.
Right. Thank you. I would like to thank all the speakers for their presentations, and also for keeping up time very nicely. So we have plenty of time for questions. We have almost 1 hour for questions, which is very good, because we have already 9 questions, well, even 10, for addressed to the first talk. And so far, we have 3 questions addressed to the second talk. We will try to do our best, but please do write your questions down, among other things, because Zoom is saving a file with these questions, and it would be very useful for the presenters to have these questions. And you know, if some of them are will go unaddressed, we can use the Facebook group to continue our discussions. So I think that Gideon Manning has already left. Gideon, well, if he's still, Gideon, if you're still here, send a line. But since Gideon said he will be leaving, and kind of Barnaby already answered very shortly, then I would say the next in line is Peter West. Peter, if you can switch on your mic.
Hi. Would you like me to read it out?
Read or develop, or in any way address your question.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Barnaby. I really enjoyed the talk. I also really enjoyed the lecture slides as well. So maybe I can make it shorter than I wrote down. I mean, I guess basically in short, the question was if there are any upshots for our knowledge, or basically what does this mean for the status of our knowledge of the union, or perhaps of ourselves as unions. And the way I phrased the question was, does the knowledge that we have of ourselves as a union survive the process that the meditator undergoes in the meditations? So I don't know if that makes sense. I can read out what I read, but maybe that's enough.
Barnaby?
I can try to answer, yeah, and then if I'm missing something, you can
Sure.
come back and tell me that I'm missing something. Yeah, so thank you for the question. So yeah, I think it's survived. I think it has to survive, and you know that's why the union comes back in Meditation 6, but also because I think the union is something he can't eradicate from his system. He doesn't have, in dualistic terms, in the terms he sets up in the kind of official ontology of the meditations, he doesn't have a way of accounting for all kinds of things that happen in the world. And so I guess my point in the talk is that yeah, it shouldn't survive the meditations if you take the meditations seriously and what he says he's doing there. But it does, and he also doesn't seem to care that it does. And that seems to have some metaphysical consequences, and here are what I take the metaphysical consequences to be.
Okay.
Am I missing something?
Yeah, maybe there's another way I can ask a similar question. So I think it makes sense to read the correspondence and his response to Princess Elizabeth in the way that you presented. And I guess maybe my question is just, do you think that both of the frameworks that you talked about are there in the meditations as well? Or is the meditations a text in which one of the frameworks is at play? Or you think that they're both there in the meditations as well?
Okay, yeah, I see your point. Yeah, I think that I think that it's not supposed to be there in the Meditations. So I take that to be a book where he's largely trying to set up an ontology, a way of doing metaphysics that would exclude this kind of thing. But it's an incomplete story. And whether he wants to be a complete story or not is kind of irrelevant. It's not a complete story. And then there's kind of the ghost of this other metaphysics there coming back at the end and saying, hey, hi, I'm still here, I'm haunting you. And another place where people push him on it. So, in like the replies to Arnaud, he says very similar things to what he says to Elizabeth. And they say, you've raised this thing, but how does this union business work? And he says something like, oh no, it just works, it's fine, what's your problem? And then, you can read that as him being evasive about it and not having the proper answer, or you can say that it's his answer and it has these metaphysical implications, and so there is this other metaphysics there, is maybe not supposed to be there, and maybe he wouldn't admit to it, and maybe he wouldn't like this reading. But I'm saying structurally, yeah, it ends up being there, despite his intentions.
Thank you.
Okay, so next question, Anne-Marie Butler.
So my question was simply that I was concerned about relativizing clear and distinct perception to different frameworks, and I found myself wondering, on the dualist framework we don't know the union, but on the other framework we do. And so what I was wondering is, if clear and distinct perception is sufficient for knowledge, it turns out that we know the union on the one framework, but not on the other. And it seemed not like the Descartes that I'm familiar with, where we have knowledge on certain frameworks, but not on others. And I had the Spinozistic worry that in the back of my mind that maybe there are even other frameworks beyond this on which there would be other knowledge. And so I was wondering if you could comment on that. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with that. I think there could well be other frameworks, and then we could have other knowledges. The union is kind of special in that there are good reasons standing for admitting that it exists, and so the necessity of having another framework for dealing with it. There might be other things that are implied in his philosophy that then end up being metaphysical commitments that are not explained through this union framework, not explained through the dualist framework, and so it might be something else. I think that's fine. I'm trying to find perspectivism in ostensibly non-perspective philosophers. And relativizing clear and distinctness to the different frameworks, yeah, I see the point that it looks weird. But I also think it works. I mean, so he definitely says we know the union clearly through the senses, and distinctly is the issue. But if distinctness is just something being in itself, not combined with something else, it does seem difficult to say that that is not a distinct idea, that that's something confused, because we're having an idea of union as one single thing. So yes, I guess that's my answer.
I think next question is Jeremy Hyman.
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
First, I want to thank you for the paper. It's a welcome break from COVID-19, which we have here in Arkansas. My question is really 1.5 questions, and it's a general question about the use of the Elizabeth text. It seems to me that the French term notion and the correlative Latin term notio and its more familiar version notior are very special terms compared to Descartes' usual epistemological vocabulary with terms like idea and conceptus. And it seems to me in those passages where he uses the notion of notion, in particular principles 148, and also the Elizabeth letter that was cited from 1643, it's only on the side of experience without any ontological or metaphysical commitment at all, because when he talks about notions, he's not yet capturing any true and immutable natures or essences. Not looked at that way, and especially also in the parallel discussions of free will, as early as 1640 to Mersenne, where he says that that's one of our first notions. He's not yet giving any ontological commitment, but secondly, he's only picking up one half of a pair of notions. In the free will case, he's experiencing intimately conscious, he later says, free will in ourselves, but not making any attempt to reconcile it with divine preordination, as he does at Principles 1, 38, 39, and 40. And so too in the case we're talking about now, the case of consciousness of our own unity, as to use the French term or person, though not the Latin term person. He's really only talking about his own experience, and there's no commitment at all to how this union would work. There's no analysis. I think people, and this is a general comment I've had for a while about people who work on the Elizabeth correspondence. I think, and when he talks about notions there, it's free of ontological commitment, just as at Principles 148, where he says that he's going to enumerate all the simple notions from which our ideas are composed. He's really only talking about components of experience. This, by the way, has important ramifications for work of Jean-Luc Marion, who I think has tied this passage of the Principles wrongly to what is going on in the rules, or at least not obviously. So that's what I think.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, that's a good point. And so in part, I would say this is why I said that he stays on what seems like a epistemological level. It's about what we know, in whether that's technical knowing or not, and maybe it's experiential, maybe it's phenomenological, and is it legitimate then to jump to metaphysics? And you might want to say, yeah, that's just not legitimate. I'm just pulling something out of a hat there, and that's fair enough. I don't particularly need this to be the only possible answer, but sorry, I'm just distracted by Daniel Cook's screen.
Share the screen, yeah.
Yeah.
But we are back.
Okay, we're back. So let's say, so you say that he used the term notion only when it has no metaphysical import. It's definitely true that he uses it in cases where he doesn't seem to think there's any metaphysical import to it. In this case, I think there is metaphysical import to it. So I'm not sure it's quite saying that it's quite the case that you can definitively say wherever he uses that, it means there's nothing metaphysical going on. And I guess the other side of that coin is saying that, yes, he's doing something experiential, and the natural thing to be would be to say, okay, if it's experiential, it's not to do with what there is. What there is only to do with subsistent ontology. There are minds and there are bodies, and somewhere else there's some God thing, and that's it. And this experience stuff is silliness. But then he still does not have an account of how these things are united, and that he seems to think in many places that they are united fine and they do interact fine, and that's not an issue. Implies that maybe they are united and they do interact, and that's an ontological feature of the world. And so what I'm doing with this is, yes, I'm taking that use of notion to have metaphysical implications, and using that to build up a metaphysical picture. And I think it's okay because he needs some basis for it, and this seems to be what he's doing. He repeatedly says, "Oh, we know the union fine through experience. So what's your problem, people who are arguing with me?" And so what does that mean ontologically when he's saying that? To just say it's just an experience and there's nothing else ontological going on, it seems to leave a lot of questions open. perhaps to say what I've said and say there's this weird dual metaphysics going on is to say something crazy beside that, but I think it's interesting. One last thing, in this case where he talks about the union and the primitive notions that the primitive notion that we have of it, he doesn't ever give a more definitive ontological account that overrides that. And he doesn't even suggest that he thinks there is one. He's pretty much consistent all the way through of suggesting that this is the account, this is what's going on. So perhaps that's some evidence that this use of notion should be taken to have metaphysical import. Yeah.
Can I just make one more comment about the Elizabeth text? If you look at the main text from 21 May, he says that there are certain primitive notions which are, the French says, original, sur le patron desquels nous formons toutes nos autres connaissances. He's very clear that the language is that of original and archetype, that they're formed on the model, that it's one idea that's derivative of another, which is very similar to what he talks about in Meditation 3, about how one idea can perhaps be born or originate from another, the second idea being an archetype. So I think it's very clear when you look at the Elizabeth text, and I've often wondered why people don't pick this up more, that he's really talking about the generation of ideas considered without any ontological commitment. But I do agree what you said in the second part of your response, that he does and has to, or perhaps doesn't, but he should give an account of interactionism. My only comment was the people who use the Elizabeth text any more than the Principles 148, which is almost an exact Latin equivalent to the main Elizabeth letter, to use that as a proof text for any account, metaphysical account, clear and distinct conception of a relation between mind and body. I just don't think that's the place to look, and I'm surprised people use that for that purpose. Seems to me what's going on there is much more like, in the Elizabeth correspondence, is much more like what's going on in Meditation 6.5, which dovetails with a comment that Dan Garber made in the chat, which I think is right, by the way.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you, Jeremy.
I think I could have done this on the basis of the Arno correspondence instead. I could have done it on the basis of the Regius correspondence, the Arno replies, or the Regius correspondence, where he's using some very different terminology, but then that's somewhat confusing because he's using this scholastic terminology and it's not very clear how much he means it and how he's using it to try to argue with Regius. I guess my final answer is that if you think that what he says about notions there can't be used at all for saying anything about how the union works, then perhaps other terminology that he uses can be used in the same way, or perhaps just an interesting way of trying to analyze what's going on in his more general attempts to bring up the union, and this provides some more information.
I think Ohad has here a finger, namely a clarificatory question. Ohad, do you want to jump in right now? You would need to turn on your mic. Ohad?
It's not to, it was just a point to you that as a way of sort of addressing a few questions together, but go on.
Oh, all right, okay, so then we should go on. There was an exchange earlier between Andrea Christophidou and Barnaby. Can we skip that, or do we have to bring it into the discussion? Andrea? Because we have a lot of questions, that's why I'm asking. I have the impression that you did clarify a number of things.
I didn't actually answer the question. I just apologized for using the wrong gender.
So then Marlene Rosamond would be the next. If she's still here.
I think Marlene left.
If not, then Dan Garber. Dan? Your Descartes
No,
question.
my point was just
an addendum to Andrea's point, but let me put it in put my point in a slightly different way. I think that one of the curious things about the exchange between Elizabeth and Descartes is she is assuming that the problem is we have two separate things and we have to figure out how to put them together. And I think the way to read Descartes' answer is that no, what we have is one thing. We begin with a mind-body unity. That is our experience in this life. And the problem of the meditations is to separate them, to show that they really are two distinct substances, not in the sense that they are two different things that are glued together, but rather that the one can exist without the other, and the other can exist without the one. So in a certain sense, there is no metaphysical problem of the union, mind and body, for Descartes in these letters, but rather the real problem is the distinction, which is what it is that he treats only in Meditation 6. So, which is to say, I think that the answer that Descartes gives to Elizabeth is not just simply dismissing her question, but I think it's a really serious answer. How it is that you can turn that into a serious metaphysics is another question.
Yeah, so I think I agree entirely, and trying to turn it into a serious metaphysics is just what I'm trying to do. Whether it works, as you say, is a question. I should say that when I mentioned at the end about the minimal self and the cogito, I was being a little bit careless because I'd seen I was running out of time. And yeah, I completely agree with both you and Andrea about that. And I even have a chapter in my dissertation about how the derivational priority of the union. So yes, I guess we could connect this back to Peter's question about whether it survives the meditations. So you start off with the union, that's unproblematic. Then you go through this process of meditating and you separate them out and you end up with this this ontology in which there are two very distinct things which have nothing in common with each other. And the issue then is there a contradiction between that and the union you started out with? I think the standard answer would be there's not a contradiction because the union that we started out with that's part of this experiential nonsense, and then that gets eliminated by the meditations. Then you have a problem of, well, how do the two things interact? I guess what I'm saying is it survives the meditations thing, but yes, he comes up with this ontology in which there seems to be warrant for saying that the two things are completely separate, and yet also the two things are united. How does that work? And then this is just an analysis of how that works.
I think we have a follow-up question here from Carla Rita Palmerino.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it was follow-up on Dan's question, because I have the impression that Dan is suggesting we start with this experience in the meditations, and then only in the sixth meditation there is that this experience does not play a very big role in the meditations themselves, because in any case it's not strong enough to help Descartes dismissing the possibility that our body is an illusion in the first meditation. It's not strong enough to conclude in the second meditation that we might be more than only a thinking soul. So my impression is that this experience only pops up in the sixth meditation itself, and then it comes to play a very central role in the exchange with Elizabeth. But I would be curious to know whether Dan and Barnaby agree with me that Descartes would have written a very different book if he had taken this experience more into account in the meditations themselves.
I agree, absolutely.
Well, I'm not sure I do. I think, Carla Rita, there's a marvelous passage in Meditation 2, where after Descartes sort of introduces the existence of the thinking thing, where Descartes says, Might I be something more than just a thinking thing? Might this body, whose existence I've called into doubt, with the skeptical arguments of meditation 1 and the demon hypothesis, might that be part of me as well? And Descartes says at that point, yes, of course it might be. I don't know. I can't deny it yet. And that, in a certain sense, carries through until the sixth meditation. That's something, by the way, that Gassendi, in his objections, repeats over and over and over again, and insists to Descartes that he never has gotten rid of the body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but then I'm not sure we disagree, because he said, my dead body, but at that point he doesn't even know whether he does have a body. And on the basis of that experience, of course, it would be clear that he does have one.
Maybe it would be useful
Of
to
course,
into the discussion here, two more questions that seem to be related with what you're saying and related to one another. So we have Willy Lechtenmäki and then Lina Jensen, and I would kindly ask you then to move to the second paper, and if we have time at the end, we will come back to Descartes, so that some Spinoza questions can be asked as well. So Willy.
Thank you, and thanks, Barnaby, for the talk. So here's my question. Let's grant the two frameworks for Descartes. And if that's the case, then I'd like to sort of ask you a bit more information of what you think is distinctive of these frameworks. So that, I mean, are they different in nature from one another? So one point one might think that the metaphysical framework, under which you can clearly and distinctly grasp mind and body separately from one another, one might think that the clarity and distinctness, for instance, that they are really specific to that framework, and that they might not be applicable at all regarding the union. And as some, I think, like the idea that Descartes might be up to something completely different in the way that he attempts to understand the union, such as doing a phenomenology, which would be sort of a completely different type of metaphysics. So that, what do you think about this suggestion? And if you're sympathetic with it, then of course we might ask that how successful gap patching is that if a system includes two radically distinct frameworks that really don't communicate with one another.
Yeah, so thanks, Billy. Yes, so I think that is more or less what I think. I would pause at phenomenological, but maybe that might just be a terminological issue. So I think there is a difference between the metaphysics, and there's a difference in the principles that they use to establish what exists. Whether clarity and distinctness crosses over, I'm not sure. So my original thought was no, they don't cross over. There's something else going on, and I'm really interested in confusion being something that is metaphysically fertile. So I'd be happy to go with that. I'm just not sure I see, given the kind of definitions that Descartes gives of clarity and distinctness, I'm not sure I see good reasons for excluding them from this other framework. Whether clarity and distinctness are then the things that that are the principles that inform the kind of ontology that get out of this framework, that's a different issue. And maybe there's more space there for saying, okay, and the kind of meditations framework, the framework gets you to dualism, you rely on clarity and distinctness to tell you what's real. In this other framework, clarity and distinctness can still be there, but it's not a guide to what's real. Perhaps that's what's going on. I'm not sure. I haven't really thought through that yet, but that's a possibility. And for phenomenological metaphysics, if that's not a contradiction in terms, then yes. Some people would think it is. I don't know if I think this is just, So what I want to avoid is the idea that this is something that comes up only on the level of experience. I think there's grounding in experience that comes up here, but then I think these elements that are grounded in experience can be used in ways outside experience. So exactly like setting up an ontology where you're saying, okay, there are minds, there are bodies, and there is union. And you can stick these things together, and you can do it from this kind of, you can do it from an intellectualist perspective. So you can sit there being Descartes, writing with your quill, thinking and taking stuff that's grounded in experience and putting it into this framework. Otherwise, it's difficult to see how he can talk about the union, because the kind of implication of saying it is just something that only exists in experience is that then the only thing you can do to do a metaphysics of union is wave your arms about. You can't talk about it. You can't use concepts to describe it. The fact that we can and do use concepts to describe it, and the fact that Descartes does, suggests there's something going on there where elements are taken and moved in between different frameworks, and that seems to give greater explanatory power. That seems to be a worthwhile thing to do. And perhaps that's also going on with phenomenology as such, but that's going way outside the topic of this seminar.
Right, next question would have been Lina Jensen. I wonder whether your question was answered, Lina, or do you want to address it?
Yes, I was going to say, I think a lot of this has actually been answered. It was largely about metaphysical and epistemological priority, which you've already said quite a bit about there. So there's only one quick thing that I wanted to raise that's left on the rest of my question after that discussion, which is a concern, I guess, about compatibility insofar as you think of both the metaphysical frameworks as involving ontology rather than just a broader metaphysics. So thinking about in a kind of flat-footed way where you might think that ontology is going to identify for you what there is in the counting sense, then you have a different conflict that you just didn't discuss in the two metaphysics. You discuss the kind of interaction versus the interaction, but not the kind of flat-footed, just give me the list of all the things there are, and they disagree. That's it. So I think that's
So,
what that means.
Yeah, okay. Well, so I think there are priority questions there, but I don't think they are absolute priority questions. So there are senses in which dualism has priority over union. There are logical senses. There are senses in which union has priority over dualism, for instance, derivational senses. I think the priorities shift depending on the perspective you take on the priorities. So I would say that ultimately there's no one metaphysics that takes priority over the other metaphysics and kind of absorbs it. And I guess what I am doing is trying to find a way to do an ontology where you can have a list of the things that there are. There is this thing, and this thing. But they're not side by side. You can have things on top of each other. So you can have minds and bodies, but you can also have union that's coextensive with those. And what are the kinds of distinction we need to make to have that happen, and how can that happen? And this answer is, hey, there are different metaphysics that are doing it. Depending on your metaphysical perspective, you're going to end up with different descriptions of the elements in the world, or different elements in the world. You want to put them all together to make one big picture. That's great. Just bear in mind that things shift depending on the perspective. I guess, yeah, that's my point.
Sure.
Right, with your kind permission, let's move now to some of Spinoza questions, because some people have asked questions and they're waiting. But before that, Ohad wanted to address a couple of the questions he got already in a sort of summary to make things, to speed up a bit the things. So Ohad, would you like to begin?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so quickly about the question of anatomy that came up. Yes, Spinoza was aware and was very interested in anatomy and precisely the points that were made through his conversation in Steno and so on. There's very good evidence for this. But the curious thing that he doesn't use it. It doesn't, he hardly mention it except for one exception. And that's what makes it so curious, that he doesn't employ the sort of the details of theology. And I just referred to Raphael Andro paper, the Spinoza Missing Physiology, from which we already cited about this. The other point, I'm now just looking for, the reference to wait, I'm kind of missing that question by Omar. Just 1 second, here it was. Yeah, so Ethics 539, there's this great passage that I'd like to read. So the proposition reads, he who has a body capable of a great many things has a mind whose greatest part is eternal. So this is very interesting. And the demonstration is, he who has a body capable of doing great many things is least troubled by evil effects. That is, by effects contrary to our nature. So he has a power of ordering and connecting the affections of his body according to the order of the intellect, and consequently of bringing it about that all the affections of the body are related to the idea of God. So this is obviously where, I think this is going. And it's also, I think, one of the things that inspired me to, think of what's the option, the way this idea of psychophysical practice. Spinoza is implying something that could be read in a very radical way. I mean, the more you enhance your bodily capacities, the more you're controlling your passions, and so you're closer to God. And so there is this idea that the example we give at the end of the paper with breathing, this whole idea that you could, breathing goes on without our knowledge or awareness, and still we can become aware of it. And the curious thing is that our becoming aware of it, our attending to it, can also affect it, or it's not clear. It's a little bit like the measuring thing in quantum mechanics, where it's not obvious whether your attention to something actually affects it or not. In this case, I mean, again, these are examples from experience. It appears that it does affect it. And it also appears that this very attention could enhance control and mastery. And again, breathing is an interesting case because it goes on at the same time. We can also control it to some extent. So this interplay, I think, is an example that brings it sort of these issues together in a very interesting way. And again, there's this room for this intuition, at least, that the more you exercise and train your body, you also improve your mental, intellectual capacities, and that kind of, in a way, brings you closer to God. And it's a wonderful passage. Just wanted to tie these things together.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. So I think perhaps Stephen Adler can go next.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for the paper, Oberto and Ohad. I had a question about what seems to be your view about the origin of the common notions and the mind's adequate idea of the body. You guys seem to want to say that not only is the mind's adequate idea of the body and the common notions incited by sensory experience, but is actually derived from it. And I thought I'd push you guys a bit on that, because it could be, it could be argued that in fact these are Spinoza's equivalent of innate ideas, ideas that the mind has as part of its basic furniture simply by virtue of being the idea of a body. And so the common notions of body will be an essential native component of the human mind by virtue of what it is. And especially that eternal idea of the formal essence of the body, which is the essence of the human mind, seems to be something, an idea that the mind has, not deriving it from experience, but essentially by virtue of what it is. So I wanted to push you guys a bit on that question. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. And Ohad?
Yeah, go ahead, Oberto. Yeah, you go. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's. I would like first to clarify a bit the terms, and like what one intends by innate, and what one intends by what one understands by the formal essence. And as to the formal essence, I personally I still struggle with that notion, and I think that it is because still my reading of Spinoza does not go sufficiently in depth. But to be honest, what I try to do when I read Spinoza talking about formal is always to relate to what he says about objective. So I refer here to maybe to Don Garrett's understanding of the fifth part of the Ethics, where he says that Spinoza in the fifth part of the Ethics invokes the notion of formal essences, because I don't think that Spinoza actually mentioned formal essences in the fifth part of the Ethics, and then he says that concept of formality is to read in opposition to the one of actuality. And again, but if you go in the Ethics, Spinoza never uses, I think explicitly at least, the concept of formality in opposition to actuality. He always uses it in opposition to objective. There is the a la Descartes. There is the objective being of things as it is represented in the mind, and there is the formal thing, that is the formal reality, the thing in itself, the thing as it is outside of the intellect. So when Spinoza says we can have knowledge of something insofar as it is formal, he's saying I have knowledge of what that thing is outside of the idea that represents it. So when Spinoza says that there is this idea of the essence of the human mind, which is conceived through God, which is eternal for this reason, which is part of the human mind, I don't tend to see that as a kind of separate aspect of the body. The body simply is that essence, and only a part of it, as Spinoza tries to demonstrate, can be understood sub specie eternitatis, adequately, according to universal laws of nature. Many aspects that our body is made of simply do not fall. We are incapable of understanding them adequately. So I'm not sure that we can understand this formal essence as something preceding the existence of the human body, or following the existence of the human body. In this sense, I'm not even sure that there is an essence that remains the same throughout the existence of the human body, if we want to understand it as from when we were born and when we will die. Because to be honest, I don't even know when I'm born. Probably when my mom and my dad crossed their sights the first time, according to Spinoza. But it's far from easy to have an adequate knowledge of what I was back in the day. Yet, I mean, I was already eternally comprehended into some extent into a divine project on that respect. So when I think that when Spinoza says that we can understand our essence under the aspect of the eternity, I think that what he's saying is that we can have a grasp of the here and now that goes beyond the temporal and spatial circumstances, and more than that, I struggled really to refine my thought, but I am not very sympathetic to Platonistic readings of Spinoza that tend to say that there is like a separate essences that exist independently on the history of the human body, and that can be grasped independently of that. I might be wrong, but
although just to clarify, my reading doesn't really imply Platonic essences. It's a matter of the contents or innate furniture of the mind, without making any metaphysical claims about there being a Platonic realm of essences. I think it kind of got hung up on the term formal there, rather than thinking about the status of these ideas in the mind.
Okay. So
Oberto, can I interject for just 1 second?
Yeah, please.
So I think that I'm very sympathetic with what Noah has written here, that that she says cognizing the body has very different senses in each of the 3 kind of cognition. So I think that's sort of one way to go. I fully agree with that. I think there would be different senses that eventually you would want to integrate with the business of, where experience plays a role, and there is, a role for the moving from basically the second to the third kind of knowledge would, involve moving into the, subspecies eternitatis perception or view. So I think one has to, it's not necessarily in conflict in Spinoza, or put it differently, I think there is room to move in between these, perceiving of changes and immediate and sort of temporal or durational versus non-temporal or eternal. So, and this could be done perhaps, hopefully, through moving the different degrees of knowledge.
Right, I think Noah Naaman Zauderer had a question related to this, related to Steve's question. Was it answered, or do you want to address?
Just 2 very, first of all, thank you very much, Ohad, Oberto, and Barnaby, for very interesting talks. And I just 2 short remarks. First of all, about the formal essence versus formal being. It's not the same. While you're right, Oberto, that formal being, following Descartes, is opposed to objective being, but formal essence is quite another thing, and it is opposed to formal essence and to actual essence. So it's actual formal concerning essences, and actual objective formal concerning beings, and it is quite another thing. Formal essence for Spinoza is the formal essence of the body is the fixed ratio of motion and rest between its parts, and the idea of this ratio is the formal essence of the mind. Although Spinoza does not speak about formal essences in the 5th part, he does use this term while defining intuitive knowledge in the 2nd scholium of Proposition 40 in part 2. So I do think that formal essences has something very central to his notion of intuitive knowledge. And from here, I just go to my first comment, that I think that the phrase knowing the body, cognizing the body, differs greatly through each of the 3 kinds of cognition. While here I'm in line with Steve's comment, because while in the first, in imagination, I experience the affections of the body, and I think that this is the indispensable stage in order to proceed to the second kind, where I'm not cognizing my particular body, but only theoretical ideas or notions, innate ideas of the properties, common properties of bodies in general. While in the third kind of cognition, I experience, in an intellectual experience, the essence of my body, the formal essence, maybe also the actual essence. This is a matter of interpretation, but I think that in each one of these cases, we experience quite another aspect of our bodies. And this must be taken into account when Ohad, your very tempting idea of yoga as a kind of proceeding in this ascent, and I wonder, I wonder if there is a continuum between this process and the third kind of. In my interpretation, there is a leap, and it's very interesting how experience my body in yoga can proceed, can contribute to my prospects to reach the third kind of knowledge. But this is thank you.
Thanks. No, I mean, I agree. I mean, I agree with what you say. I think these are great comments. Oberto, maybe you want to respond.
Yeah, thank you again. And yeah, I take it that probably we have different views on what formal means in Spinoza, but still, I don't see Spinoza never opposing formal and actual explicitly. And in the second part, he uses it as opposed to objective being. So I repeat, I simply don't feel confident enough to draw these conclusions. I'm not saying that these interpretations are wrong. I say that I don't feel confident to go on board this train. And as far as the idea that we have a cognition of ourselves, of ourselves, I mean, what I try to demonstrate in this paper is that we are basically always cognizing ourselves. I mean, the whole amount of our perceptions is what is cognition of our body. So to cognize our own particular body, as you say, Noah, as distinguished from other bodies, that is an exercise of, first, of the imagination that tries to see to some extent how I interrelate with other images, but assuming that the whole images that I have into my idea are to some extent perceptions of my own body, I can never fail to perceive my own body, according to Spinoza. That's and that is that provides the scope of knowledge, the range of knowledge, the boundaries of knowledge itself. So the idea is with which degree of how can I say, certainty you draw conclusions about yourselves when you try to locate yourself into the natural framework. And for doing these things, you have to try to see whether there are universal, eternal aspects in you, whether these are innate or not. I repeat, it would be important to understand, first of all, what it means to innate, but aspects that you find within, embedded into your perceptions, that can relate also to universal properties of natures that allow you to create that image of nature that also involves your body, and to have to some extent cognition of yourself under a species of eternity. But in this sense, if there are leaps in the way in which we know things, not necessarily related to the object, as long as the object is always the body. Of course, Spinoza then distinguishes what is a property, a universal property, and what is an essence, and why we conceive separately individual essences and properties. But it's not this the aspect I wanted to stress on. The fact is that we never fail to know one and the same thing, and that is the human essence, formal or not, but that is, and for Spinoza, the human essence is basically a certain way in which our desire, in which our action, in which our will takes form at each moment. So I think that would be my point, but thank you for the question.
Right, dear friends, let me tell you that kind of nominally our time is up, but we still have 5 questions to go, at least. I think more have just appeared. So we have a number of Descartes questions, a number of Spinoza questions. On my list are Dan Garber with a Spinoza question, and then Omar Del Nano with a Spinoza question, Philip Wyss with a kind of question that addresses both subjects, and then Bill Eaton with a Descartes question. And then Denise has addressed a new comment on the comments section. Maybe if some of you want to address the question, can you please keep it very short? Dan.
Thank you very much. Given the hour, I'll just pass and talk with the guys privately.
Right. Okay. So
in
then,
any case, the questions are up there for people to.
Omar Del Nano, a very short version of the question.
So my question was partially addressed already. Then it's fine if we are out of time.
Okay, Philip Wyss.
Okay, I'm afraid that my question would lead to a bit too much discussion, so I will leave it also. Perhaps I will contact the speakers personally with a mail or so. Thank you.
You are all wonderful. Mateus Ramos Mendes. Who is not here?
Okay. Some of my questions are already answered, so that's fine. Thank you.
Bill Eaton. Bill? Okay, Bill is wishing us norok, which means cheers in Romanian. I suspect that we are done, therefore. If people want, we can send the file with questions and comments via email. That's possible. So we are done.
I think, by the way, everybody can save the file directly from the Zoom.
Oh, okay. That's a good.
There's a little at the very bottom of the chat. There's a little thing that says file, which if you put it, will tell you different places where you can store it.
That's great and very useful.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this brings us to the conclusion. Let me thank you all. Thank, first of all, the speakers. Thank all the participants. This was a fantastic session. Let me just tell you that we were over 80 to begin with, I think 83, and there were more than 20 participants on YouTube channel. So there was a very well attended question. Please do subscribe to the YouTube channel. Subscribe to our Facebook group. Let's move some of the questions that were not answered or discussions on the Facebook group. We can use it as a place where we can discuss issues. Next week, we will have Gideon Manning on anatomy, mechanism, and teleology in Descartes physiology. Till then, all the best to all of you. Stay safe. Bye.